Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of actually not true. This is a new discussion, right? We are now pivoting into Unit 7 out of 9. We only have a few more units left to go in this entire coursework, which is wild when you think about it, right? The thing about it though is we are now starting that next unit of content, right? We're starting unit number 7, and unit 7 is 19th century perspectives and political developments, right? But what I like to refer to this as is nationalism, imperialism, and all the stuff in between, all right? So those are the main core cruxes of what we're going to be talking about in this unit, right? We're going to talk about nationalistic movements that are going to unify people together and create new countries. We are then going to talk about how scientific perspectives are going to change quite a bit due to people like Darwin and Freud and other thinkers in like the modernist, positivist, relativist, irrationalist spheres and stuff like that. Going to be another really good graphic organizer opportunity there, Molly White. So going into it though, we are starting this next new unit, okay? So big new piece of paper, nice big new title, and let's go ahead and dive head first into this before I actually clip in an old flip and we talk a little bit about it from a different perspective, all right? But what we're starting off with though in this is nationalism, right? We're starting off by talking about that thing that we discussed that began to bubble up under the surface after the invasions of Napoleon in the early 1800s. But now that pot is not just bubbling, it's about to overflow yet again, right? Nationalism is a growing force in Europe during the 1800s, which is beginning to unify groups of people together across religious lines and bringing them together along cultural ones, right? What nationalism is, though, if you're really delving into it, is something that we kind of tried to dip our toes into with the warm-up a little bit yesterday. It is pride in one's nation or people and the belief in their group's genius, all right? Genius is what we were getting at with like the American food question inside the warm-up yesterday, right? There is a genius that Americans believe that they have when it comes to things we make or things we do or songs we have or sports we play, right? It's that shared history, language, or culture, a thing that is our own that we think is awesome that's different from everybody else, right? And so what's beginning to happen though also in the 1800s in like Europe at the time when nationalism is beginning to actually show up is the rise of the nation state. Now, this is a growing concept in the 1800s because before the nation state concept, we had kingdoms or territories and fluctuating empires and stuff like that. But in the 1800s, you're beginning to see new countries advocate for themselves based on common culture. Examples of this are going to be Germany, Italy, Hungary, areas that are going to begin to look at other territories that speak their same language or other areas that share cultural things with them, and they want to create new nation states, right? Or new countries, if you will. Because basically the Europe that we're talking about at this moment looked a lot like this, right? But after nationalism, it's going to look a lot like this, right? Where the lines are drawn more on cultural boundaries and where most of the people in France speak French, most of the Italians in Italy speak Italian, Romanians, Bulgarians, and all these other countries are popping up in the wake of the downfall of all these empires that gobbled up a lot of stuff during that concert of Europe period, right? Now, why is this or important though? The nation or its people? It's mostly due to the fact that you were talking about two very distinct different groups of people because we haven't gotten to nations yet. We are still just along groups of people, right? So keep that in the back of your mind. Now, the causes of this sense of nationalism are a multitude of different causes, right? Romanticism actually had a major cause on it. That art movement that we talked about, that was unbounded imagination and intensity, which focused on stories and images that related to national identity, right? So you've got the Grimm brothers who told fairy tale stories that mostly they had taken from German sources. You got Caspar David Friedrich who did The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, trying to show the natural beauty of the German lands. And then you got Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables, which was all about a revolution that took place following the French one, about French people just driving forward the idea of a national unity, right? The other big cause of nationalism during this time period as well is going to be liberal reform, right? You're going to see people like Napoleon III showing up, creating those new jobs, hiring Baron de Haussmann to create cultural identity even within the architecture of a city, right? On how to like rebuild Paris to the glorious sense of national pride that he wanted. They're going to use programs like these under Napoleon III to encourage nationalism and allegiance to the new state, right? Programs that liberal reformists are going to actually believe in are universal suffrage to give people more of a voice in their government, the creation of work like Baron Haussmann did, and also limiting tariffs, which are going to help boom the economy because tariffs actually typically stifle an economy and stifle an economy rather than giving it free market capabilities. All right, so these things are actually going to lead to a sense of nationalism as well. But what I'm going to do right now is clip in that old flip, and you're going to watch it all the way up forward, though. You're going to see some positives of nationalism, some negatives of it as well. And we're going to talk about a very key story about a man by the name of Alfred Dreyfus, right? So focus in on all that stuff. And also, if any other new words pop up in these areas up here, ignore them and just move on with your day, because it's stuff that I deleted that I didn't think you needed anymore. But go ahead and watch this flip. I'll see y'all soon. Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flip classroom and our continuing discussion of Unit 7, right, where we are all up in the embroilment of nationalism that is beginning to sweep across the continent of Europe during the late 1800s, right? So we are now in that back half of the late 1800s. We are still all up in the 1800s, which is probably the most boring 100 years of AP European history, but it's okay because we're going to push through it, we're going to get it done, we're going to get after it, right? The big thing about it, though, is we're going to pick up right where we left off in class, talking about the growth of nationalistic fervor throughout the continent and its biggest causes, right? And we're basically talking about like how this is going to lead to different fracturings and how it's going to be not just for nation states, but also for smaller groups of people desiring their own nation state, and how nationalism was also going to help lead to this concept called self-determination, right? Self-determination we'll talk about a lot when we get into the political unification of Italy, all right? But let's not keep this flip too long in terms of time. Let's go ahead and get after it a little bit and pick up right where we left off in class, talking about how liberal reform under new conservative leaders is going to help actually push nationalism forward, right? So we left off talking about how Napoleon III is going to come in as a conservative leader of France, and he's going to use a liberalized platform to actually encourage allegiance to the nation state of France, right? He's going to usher in universal suffrage. He's going to create work and job opportunities using the Haussmann reforms. He's going to limit tariffs and allow the economy to boom. And the other big thing that we need to understand about Napoleon III is he's politically very reactionary, right? He would actually react to certain situations. You'll actually see this happen a little bit later on the flip when we talk about the unification of Italy, right? But he was politically reactionary, and he would actually go with political opinion and allow it to kind of push and move the things that he did to keep the people loyal to his actual government, right? Until, of course, his tragic downfall after the Battle of the Sedan during the Franco-Prussian War, right? But you don't need to know about that just yet, right? But let's keep going into it and talking about how unification is also going to help lead to the growth of nationalism, right? Because even before the unification of Italy and even before the unification of Germany, people have been calling for this for a long time, right? You can look at the fact that the Frankfurt Parliament was an early attempt at the unification of Germany, right? That thing that popped up during the revolutions of 1848 were one of the biggest demands that they had from Frederick Wilhelm IV, right? The king of Prussia at the time, the gutter crown king, right? Remember that guy, right? With his fancy little gesture and stuff like that. Grace knows him, of course, like this. Exactly. So like that guy right there who said, I refuse to take this ground for the gutter, and is going to have that Frankfurt Parliament liquidated, that's going to actually, though, serve as an inspiring motivation behind nationalism, right? Nationalists in Germany are going to actually begin to identify with the idea of a unified German state because the Frankfurt Parliament is going to suggest it, right? Another very famous figure as well is an Italian figure known as Giuseppe Mazzini, and Giuseppe Mazzini actually started a movement called Young Italy, right? And it throughout giving like impassioned speeches and emboldened pamphlets, very, very like prolific writings that talking about why Italy and Italians with their shared culture and their shared language deserve to be their own country, is going to try to actually unify Italy very early on. However, ironically enough, his actual ideas would be seen as too idealistic and things like that, right? So going into it, though, he gave these impassioned speeches, he held these mass demonstrations demanding a unified Italy, even though it didn't really work out. It was unsuccessful, but what about that idea, right? It's all about the infectious idea, right? Ideas are a lot like a virus, and especially a lot like nationalism, they spread very quickly, right? And so the idea of nationalism is now sitting in the guts, in the minds, and in the hearts of like Italians, right? And also it's sitting in the guts, in the minds, and the hearts of people who speak German, right? And we're seeing the growth of this idea of a nation state being bonded around that shared cultural value, right? Now going on as well, you're also going to see a nationalism pop up in terms of this thing called racialism, right? Racialism is the feelings of superiority of a race, right? Now really quickly, you have to understand that racial racialism and racism are two different things, because I'm putting up here positive and negative. I just need you to know that racialism and racism are different things, right? Racism is the idea that your race is superior in every way to others, and then you should use violence to suppress the other ones, whereas racialism is trying to get to the idea of the feelings of superiority of your group, right, above others, and not in a violent or like anti-way, right? So one of the ways that you could see this actually as being like a positive force is actually in the pan-Slavic movement that's going to be happening in the 1900s, right? So just talking about what we're getting at, how, of course, Penelope knows that song and stuff like that like the Slav life song or whatever. But going into it, you need to understand that these countries right here are the ones that would identify with Slavic heritage, right? Slavic heritage is mostly in Eastern Europe. They're mostly Eastern Orthodox Christians. They use a completely different alphabet. Their language dialectical sense is very, very different. The Cyrillic alphabet, like I was just talking about, the different alphabet, is completely different. And they live a very culturally different life, right? The thing you need to understand, though, is that Slavic people are beginning to identify with their Slavic heritage, right? And this is going to lead to this is going to lead to a movement known as Pan-Slavism, where a lot of Slavic people and a lot of Slavic countries, a lot of Slavic groups are going to begin calling for their own countries, right? The nationalism amongst these individual groups of Slavs is going to grow very, very heavily. However, they were controlled by others. Most of these people were actually controlled and dominated by other groups of other countries. For example, Austria-Hungary, actually with their new dual monarchy as of 1867, is going to control many of places like Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, all full of Slavic people, right? Another big one is the Ottomans, who control places like Bulgaria, and don't tell Romanians they're Slavic because they don't believe that. So like now because they have a Latin-based language. But also they control places like Bulgaria, Macedonia, like Albania, and areas like that as well, right? So what's going to end up going on, though, is that Russia is going to enter in as a heavy supporter of these nations during World War I and leading up to World War I, and also leading to them fighting wars against people like the Ottomans, right? Like they're going to fight wars against the Ottomans and try to actually make it so the Ottomans retract their lands and give up some of these Slavic areas, and they support a lot of the Slavic countries in these things like the Balkan Wars, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, you need to understand that there is a massive negative to racialism, and that is, of course, the growth of anti-Semitism that was going on in the late 1800s as well in Europe. Now, anti-Semitism, what it is, you need to know, because, of course, everything that we're about to talk about is a lot of hot-button issues in the modern-day era, right? So the anti-Semitic movement that is going on, that is a negative of this idea of racialism, is the idea that basically it's feelings of or showing of hostility towards the Jewish people, okay? So, for example, when you think Hitler and the Nazis, anti-Semitic, right? When you think of the ancient Romans, anti-Semitic, right? You have to understand that this movement, though, this idea of anti-Semitism has been going on in Europe for, 2,000 years up to this point, right? So it's been going on in a heavy way and has led to the segregation and terrible treatment of many different people in Jewish communities, because that's what we need to understand. Is this a new concept? No, it's not. It's been going on in European history for quite some time. But many countries, though, are beginning to move in a direction of passing laws to end that direct discrimination of Jewish people. Now, the thing about that is, though, is that's not going to necessarily stop people from actually doing it indirectly, right? So many countries are going to pass laws to end direct discrimination where you could actually be arrested. If we actually look all the way back to Joseph II of Austria and his enlightened absolutism, he actually passed laws to end the discrimination of Jewish people. However, that doesn't stop the private citizen from indirectly discriminating against Jewish people, right? Now, a good example of this is actually you're going to see this thing that happened in 1873, which was a large-scale stock market crash, right? And when the stock market actually crashed in 1873, a lot of citizens of different European countries are going to blame Jewish people, right? They're actually going to blame Jewish people because the stock market was not actually as heavily bet on or relied upon by many people in the Jewish community, so they actually were able to retain a large chunk of their wealth, whereas many other Protestants and Catholic citizens of other countries are actually going to see a massive loss in their stock exchanges. And so they're going to begin to blame Jewish people as manipulating the stock market and leading to the downfall of it later on. Now, this is absolutely ridiculous, and it's not actually true whatsoever, but it's going to lead to an uptick in the growth of anti-Semitic, actually attacks, and also the anti-Semitic business dealings and boycotts of Jewish businesses. Now, the best
best example of anti-Semitism that was going on, like the stock market crash of 1873, you can basically all but forget that, just because literally it's just kind of like a pebble in the stream that shows us that anti-Semitism is kind of a thing that fluctuates throughout time, and they, of course, are going to, like many European nations, are going to use any excuse they can to, like, regrow these ideas. But the best example of anti-Semitic behavior that ever actually popped up in European history, probably in the 1800s anyway, is this thing known as the Dreyfus Affair, right? And the Dreyfus Affair all centers around this guy, Alfred Dreyfus, right? And this happened in 1894 to 1906. Now, some of y'all are going to get a little bit frustrated about that year because they are like, Mr. Terry, wait a minute. We haven't even talked about the unification of Italy yet. That happens in 1861. We haven't even talked about the unification of Germany. That happens in 1871. And why are we now talking about something that happened in 1894? Well, we have to like look forward a little bit and use the Dreyfus Affair as an example of the growth of anti-Semitism leading into the growth of this thing known as Zionism here in about 2 seconds, right? So in 1894 to 1906, the Dreyfus Affair was a major court battle, okay? So what you need to understand about the Dreyfus Affair, you can take a couple of notes on this, or you can actually jump down and watch the video that I actually posted in the description that completely animates this entire story and tells it very, very well, right? But what ends up happening is Alfred Dreyfus, okay, or actually, excuse me, by this point in European history, by 1894, Germany has now become a country, okay? Germany exists as a country, and they have used industrial growth and new government programs to become a very, very strong country as well. And also, in the process of becoming a country, they heavily embarrassed France, right? They embarrassed them by beating them relentlessly in this big war known as the Franco-Prussian War, right? So what's going to end up going down is that now that France has been embarrassed by the Germans, right? They are going to begin to build up their military in the hopes of maybe that if they ever go to war with Germany again, that they'll be able to stop them and be able to deal a very, very large hurt against them. And the other thing, speaking of hurt, is that the French feel very, very hurt because literally the Germans took a very large chunk of land from them, right? And it's known as Alsace-Lorraine, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit later on when we actually get into the unification of Germany as well. But just keep it in the back of your mind, Alsace-Lorraine, right? So the thing about it, though, is that the Germans and the French are going to have this heated rivalry that's based on nationalistic lines, right? Well, what's going to end up going down is the French are going to try and build up new military weapons to stop the Germans. But what's going to end up happening is those plans for those military weapons are going to be leaked to the Germans, and the Germans end up with them in their hands, right? Well, the French then go into a desperate fit trying to figure out who the front door leaked these plans to the Germans, right? And they all but settle in on this one guy. They blame a man by the name of Alfred Dreyfus because they go into the military records and they see that Alfred Dreyfus was born in Alsace-Lorraine. They see that his very first language was German, and they put him on trial for actually like leaking these plans and documents. Now, the thing about it is many people refer to the Dreyfus Affair trial as a kangaroo court, right? A kangaroo court basically means the outcome is all but determined, right? That the second that Dreyfus walked in the door, he was already guilty as far as everyone was concerned, right? Even though, ironically enough, there was no evidence to convict Alfred Dreyfus, right? The notes that were written to the Germans were not in Alfred Dreyfus's handwriting, and the prosecution said, oh, well, you changed your handwriting, right? And that's not true at all. But he basically gets convicted of a crime he did not commit, and he gets separated from his family, his wife and children, and he gets sent off the coast of South America, where he's placed in prison at this place called Devil's Island, right? And then what ends up happening, though, is this story surfaces inside of the French society. He is militarily degraded. They break his sword in front of him. They rip all the insignias off of his uniform, and they basically make him out to be a scapegoat, right? And what ends up going down, though, is that these people coalesce around him, and they start hearing about this trial. And many liberals are going to begin to rally around Dreyfus's cause, being like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. He didn't do anything. And as several writers end up showing up, well, for example, like Emile Zola, and they're like, you know why they really blamed him? Because he's Jewish, right? And the thing about it is that's what it came out to the forefront, is the fact that they believe that Dreyfus was the very perfect scapegoat, because not only was he from Alsace-Lorraine, not only did his first language was German, but he's also a Jewish person. So no one would get mad when they actually blamed him for the ones leaking the plans. They actually find out later on as well that it was never Dreyfus in the first place. That was actually this other guy named Esterhazy, who was actually a French nationalist who sold the plans to Germany and then literally runs away to England, right? After, of course, being put on trial, and they found him not guilty and all this other ridiculous stuff. So what this whole trial is going to do, though, and the craziness about the Alfred Dreyfus Affair, or the Dreyfus Affair, it's going to lead to this entire fissure in the French government, right? And it's going to show us that we're now got two groups in the French government. You got pro-nationalistic French Republicans, and you have Catholic anti-Semite conservatives, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is that there was a very major article that came out that exposed this entire thing to the entire French community and just demonstrated the growth of anti-Semitism in France at the time, right? And it was called J'accuse, and it was actually written by this guy named Emile Zola.
J'accuse, Miller. J'accuse.
Exactly, and it's even referenced in New Girl. So going into it, what you have to understand, though, is that the Dreyfus Affair is going to see the formal split of the state and church in France, right? And so bishops and priests are now going to be paid solely by the church because literally these conservative Catholic Christians are no longer going to be able to actually hold up their government or hold up their ideas based on these anti-Semitic conservative values, right? And so also what you need to understand, though, is Catholic schools are going to lose 30% of their students because they're no longer being government funded. And what this is going to do is it's going to help solidify the French government as a nationalist state, not a Catholic one, right? And so the Dreyfus Affair is not only going to demonstrate to us the growth of anti-Semitism, but it's also going to demonstrate to us how literally separating yourself from religion can actually encourage the more solidified nationalistic state, right? So going into it, also what you need